I think when it comes to like revolutions, it's hard to keep them alive, especially if you look at a lot of other places where there's been revolutions. And what I mean by that is it's just like after the first generation, the revolutionary generation passes, it becomes, I think, more difficult for the next generation to know like what it is that they have to lose. Like, what was it like before the revolution? And I think that's why so many politicians in the US thought that like after Castro died, Cuba was done. But the revolution has continued. And as we saw with these recent protests, like people came out in mass to demonstrate their solidarity with the revolution. So what do you think it is about Cuba that like 3 generations later now is able to, you know, maintain this sort of understanding across the population of the importance of this revolution, despite it having happened so long ago?
Yeah, it's something that they talk about quite a lot in Cuba, actually. Every generation, every new generation needs its heroic moment, or it needs its space to be protagonistic. It needs to recreate the revolution in its own image. So in, you know, just after the revolution, you had a generation who were probably too young to participate in the either the underground urban movement or the guerrilla struggle, but they then played an absolutely essential role in the literacy campaign. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of young people who went, you know, all around the country, up mountains and into jungles, over fields and so on, to teach their fellow Cubans to read and write. Then subsequently you have the internationalist missions. And so for the 1970s, the really big project is the something like 400,000 Cubans who went voluntarily to Angola to help the Angolans fight for their independence against the invading army of white army of apartheid South Africa. And, you know, Nelson Mandela himself, there's a new film which I can't wait to see about you know, Cuba and Africa and focusing on that. Nelson Mandela himself said this was the Cubans' assistance to Angola, and the victory that led to was essential in the defeat of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So that was that generation. And then, you know, you had similar programs that the intervention in Angola starts in the 70s, ends in the 80s. And then, you know, you have survival mode. The 1990s is just, but you have those heroic acts, you know, of sacrifice and commitment, which I began this show by talking to about the young Cubans who volunteered to go and do this extremely hard work in the countryside to help feed the nation. And then in the 2000 periods, and there's a whole chapter on my book, We Are Cuba, about this, is the battle of ideas, which begins as the battle to get the little shipwrecked Cuban boy, Elian Gonzalez, from Miami back to his loving father in Cuba. And that turns into a huge international battle. And so I think we get to the 2010s and on, and then this becomes a question, right? What is the sort of the heroic struggle or the sort of protagonistic role of young Cubans? And, you know, when we were talking about what happened on the 11th of July, and we talked about COVID, well, another really important aspect here is, you know, I've talked about the organizations of the masses. Cubans have many forums in which they debate, argue, dispute, confer, agree, and so on. In their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, in their study centers, in schools, and so on. With COVID, because Cuba took a very strict path from an epidemiological perspective, it was, you know, it was the correct thing to do. They closed down many public spaces and collective spaces. And what that meant is that the Cubans didn't have those forums where they can normally thrash out, you know, make criticisms, come to agreements, understand different perspectives, and so on. And that coincides, I mean, that comes shortly after the number of Cubans who are accessing social media on their phones increases massively. So that's from 2018, and it goes up and up and up. So what this means is that during this COVID period, the economic situation is deteriorating. The health situation from summer becomes quite scary with the surge of COVID cases, still comparatively minimal compared even to Britain. But for the Cubans, it's very alarming. And at the same time, you know, what they're getting so much influence through social media. And social media is it's not, you know, spontaneously generated material. There are social media influencers who are set up with funding and put there with a political objective to tell Cubans that all of their problems are not the result of the US sanctions or a COVID pandemic that the whole world is suffering, but actually incompetence and inefficiency by the government, or the government doesn't care, and so on. So, you know, that was a really key thing. Now, how does the Cuban government respond? How does it respond to this problem? There clearly is a problem among young Cubans. And I think you touched on the point, which I think is vitally important. People in Cuba are so accustomed to having, you know, 96% of Cubans own their own home. They don't face the fear of homelessness that is faced around the world. They own their own home. If they rent a home, they can not legally pay more than 4% of their income. They have free access to healthcare, education, things like utilities. Even now they're complaining that the cost of electricity's gone up. It's still heavily subsidized. Transport is heavily subsidized, even though some of the costs have just gone up. It remains heavily subsidized. So in a sense, the problem is that a lot of Cubans take that for granted. And then they look over outside and more influence from social media. They want some of the best of consumer capitalist societies, but they certainly don't want it at the cost of what the socialist state provides them. And I think this is a dilemma. You know, how does the Cuban government and its institutions tackle that problem, tackle that gulf between lived experience and aspirations? And yeah, I mean, the way that they've done it till now is politics and ideology and talking all the time. And I think, well, I just want to say something else, because we talked about the 11th of July, but there was also aspirations or hopes, investments, let's say, in making, in reproducing or that protest on the 15th of November. You probably heard about that, right? And the US officials from September to 15th of November made 180 statements, whether they were tweets or statements, about these great big protests that were going to take place, you know, against
180.
Against the Cuban regime. And it was essentially, for the objectives, it was a flop. Now, partly it was a flop because the Cuban government has not stopped. Miguel Diaz-Canel personally hasn't stopped for one day since the 11th of July actually addressing the problems which motivated people to come out on the street and complain. And he has gone, along with Gerardo Hernandez, who is very much held up as a hero in Cuba. He's one of the Cuban Five, who was, you know, incarcerated in the United States for having infiltrated right-wing Miami organizations and to find out about plans against Cuban people and so on and so forth. And they have gone to poor neighborhoods, majority black neighborhoods, and they have talked to people. They have helped to reinvigorate those grassroots organizations, which, as I said, were later partly because of COVID, but partly because there's a certain complacency there anyway. And in some ways, what happened on the 11th of July has been politically useful for Cuba. I mean, I don't know if you saw, 2 days ago, there was a huge march. They have the university students, 27th of November, they have a huge march anyway to commemorate some medical students. But, you know, it was massive. And this is young people going out, also commemorations around the 5th anniversary of Fidel Castro's death. So in some ways, this has really kind of forced key leaders to not postpone addressing, but to address right now some of the socio and economic problems that they have, and to increase the level of communication with the population. Because, you know, outside of Cuba, people love to mock Fidel Castro for his 4-hour speeches. But actually, many Cubans will say to you that they miss that that, you know, having that engagement with Fidel, although he was the one talking, they felt like it was a conversation. And he would talk about things. He would go from the great big schema of globalization and global relations and imperialism, theory, and so on, to their everyday problems, the price of bread, as we can say, the price of malanga, you know, the cost of an electricity, and if you leave your bulb on for an hour, how much it costs, and how much the state pays, and how much you pay out of your pocket. You know, these kind of, they might seem outside of Cuba banal explanations, but actually they were really important. Cubans are very highly educated, and you know, they like to understand exactly what the scenario is. And I think even the fact that the day after the 11th of July protests, you had the minister of electricity explaining why there were these blackouts, what, you know, the problem of obtaining fuels. And then actually he was interrupted by Miguel Diaz-Canel, who happens to be an electrical engineer by training, and he also used to teach at the university, who explained that, you know, different facilities or different generators use different fuels, and they have had problems getting certain fuels, so they have to use certain other. If they use other fuels, it can lead to maintenance problems and breakdowns, and then they need spare parts. And, you know, really contextualizing this. So it's not, the blockade, it's just an excuse. No, the blockade actually obstructs us in every sector in the following ways, you know, and that kind of engagement and dialogue. So I do feel like there has been a little, we've had one of those moments, and there's been quite a few. Like I was saying, I was living in Cuba on and off during the Battle of Ideas era, visiting Cuba a lot, a kind of reanimation, of these organizations, the massive remobilization. And I think there are clearly young people in Cuba who are just thinking about, you know, their individual consumption and all the rest of it, and can their aspirations be fulfilled in Cuba or not? Do they have to leave? But I do feel like there has been a level of re-engagement, certainly over the last couple of months, when maybe feeling that there is a threat to the revolution, there is a threat to the socialist society, and a sort of re-evaluation of, if that was taken away, what would they lose?